Everybody, I'm going to share with you how to foundation paper piece today. I'm going to be using my To the Stars pattern pack. It comes with 16 different patterns. There are 8 block sizes in full inch increments from 2 to 9 inch, and each square block size comes with a little star and a big star. So you get lots of fun options. This is a great video just to see how to paper piece though, because it can be a little tricky, but we're going to try and share exactly how to do it and make it easy for you. This is the 6-inch big star pattern, as you can see. The star doesn't really matter because it's a star, but if you are paper piecing, you are mirror image paper piecing. So say this was the typical way that it is, you would actually sew it together like this. See how it's a mirrored image? And when you're done, it would look like this. It's a little bit something to wrap your head around to start, but let's hope we can work through that today. So what I've done first is I have taken the pattern and printed it out, and then I have trimmed it pretty close to that lighter line. That lighter line is your cut line. The darker lines are your seam lines. You're actually going to sew directly on top of those lines. You can trim it down directly on that light line or a 1/4 inch away from the dark line if you want to use paper scissors or a paper rotary cutter, or you can leave it and just trim it after with the fabric, which is what I typically do. I do tend to go through rotary cutters faster, but that's okay. Some things you're going to need today is a sewing machine, of course, with matching thread if you would like. I typically use white. Scissors are very handy for paper piecing because you have to cut a lot of pieces. And I have this roller. It's a wooden roller. This one is from Violet Craft. I love it. It is to press your seams down after they're sewn, and it helps flatten them when you don't have access to an iron. Otherwise, I'd say have your iron super handy. Okay, these are my fabrics over here. So I don't do this with every pattern, but I recommended it for my star pattern because you don't have tons of pieces. Typically with FPP, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my fabric and I'm gonna always go to the edge in a corner to use as little as fabric as possible. This is my background fabric, by the way, not my star fabric. My star fabric will be this acid yellow. So I'm gonna take my piece here and I'm gonna put it right side facing down. I want the wrong side facing up. And I'm going to take my pattern piece and put the wrong side of the pattern piece, not the printed side, on my fabric. So this is going to be wrong sides together, right sides facing you and facing away from you. And I'm going to cut out that piece. Now this one has, this section is the star. So you could align that a little differently so you don't waste fabric in that star space. So I could cut here, and I could cut across here and then down, or I could just cut around the whole thing. I tend to like to not waste, so I'm gonna cut here and then I will cut down here. So now you have a piece of fabric that is for this background section, roughly 1/2 inch bigger all around, 1/4 inch bigger than after you account for the seam allowance. And it's cut roughly to size. You can also see, we'll get to this when we actually piece, that the larger pieces on my patterns, well, let's take a step back. The patterns are numbered, and that means that this says B1 and B2, and that means that you have this fabric on first and then you sew this fabric. So that's only a 2-piece section, so it makes a little bit more sense when you come. I'm gonna angle it to the side. So you would put this fabric across the back first, then you would sew on D2, and then you would sew on D3. And I'll explain how to do that as we go along. But just so you know, usually on my patterns and most FPP patterns, unless it doesn't make sense to do it, we start with the largest piece if possible. Sometimes you can't. Okay, so what I'm going to do is set this aside until I get to the point. And this is a star part, so this is all star fabric. So I'm going to set that aside. And I'm going to cut out those. I have a few scraps over here that I could probably get this fabric out of. Now, this fabric I'm using is non-directional. So that means any way you put it, you can basically see the same fabric. And a directional print would be, this is a directional print of fabric. So it looks the correct direction here, but if you turn it, it's going to change the way it looks. So when you're starting out with FPP, I would not recommend using directional fabric because you get some angled seams and you're going to have to kind of play and schmooze around with it if you want all your fabric to go in the same direction. If you don't care about direction, go for it, but I recommend, just to not make your brain hurt, to just use a non-directional fabric to start. So I am going to lay this again. We're putting the back of the pattern, wrong side of the pattern, to the wrong side of the fabric, and cut out another piece here that is a little bit bigger. And you can do as much extra or as little extra as you feel comfortable with. This pattern is relatively straightforward. So there's sometimes when you have to line it up and it is tricky. So you want a little extra around. So I have that, and then I'm going to need the top portion of it. So I'm going to lay it along this straight edge. Even though this is the middle, I still need a seam allowance on the fabric. So keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be pretty. You're going to trim these up nicely later. I'm going to keep those two together over there, and I have one last section to do with background fabric. There is one section. Because this is just a weird piece, I'm going to keep that on there, and once it's trimmed, I might cut that down for scraps. But you do what is most comfortable with you. I'm just trying to find the best fit here. So there's this little waist, but sometimes with FPP, which is short for foundation paper piecing, in case you didn't know that, it is really hard. Sometimes what I do, if I need to cut a little bit past that line, is I fold it in half. You can fold it in half this way first and then fold it in half that way. I do find that where the ink is, the paper tends to fold very easily, so you don't have to do it that way. Okay, there are my sections. Let's move this guy out of the way. 2 pieces for this. 2 pieces for this guy, 1 piece for this guy, and now we have to cut the star fabric, which we're going to use this acetal yellow lime green color. These are for the rest of the block. I am going to sew this star block into a sawtooth star as the middle. So let's open this up with the To the Stars pattern. The stars can be one solid color or this piece for the middle, and you can see this is in reverse right here. So we'll talk about that more. It has seam lines, so you can make the star 6 different fabrics with all the points being a different fabric. You can make the middle a different fabric and the points all a same second fabric, or you can make it all one fabric like this, which is what I'm doing here. So I'm actually going to just cut this whole thing out of one solid piece because I don't need those seams. You could have them just for the visual. You can see it would look different if it had the seams that go across there. It's up to you, but for today I am just going to cut that out and set that aside. And then I have all these little wedges. I have 3 wedges left that I need to cut. And I'm just going to kind of put my fabric on top, maybe do a little fold over I like to be generous with how much fabric I cut out. Here's a little wedge, and I'll put that with those two. I've got a couple other wedges. Another thing you can do is cut a rectangle, and you have plenty there for that guy. And then another rectangle, and we've got plenty there for that guy. You can kind of see this through. Nope, you guys can't because of the light. But if I fold it back and I put my finger on that line, that kind of helps me see, oh, I've got that much left over. I want my fabric to be a 1/4 inch larger all around. You can kind of see the faint line. And I want my fabric to go through the seam allowance, and I want it to be back here a little bit past the point so that I am not having my fabric right to that point where the seams are. Just think of it as a regular seam where you want your fabric to be 1/4 inch away from those seams all around. So that goes right here. So I've got my piles and we are ready to sew. So I am going to take these to my machine and I am going to show you how to sew, and I am going to show you what to do with this and how to trim that 1/4 inch. So let's move on. Okay, we're over my sewing machine. I hope that this is a good vantage point. We will check it out. I am going to stitch this down. I am going to just do that for cutting purposes. You don't otherwise have to do anything on this unless you're sewing with different fabrics and you sew along the seam. For this purpose, because I just need it to stay in place while I trim it down to size, I'm going to stitch along this very outer line. Typically you don't stitch there. So this is just in this special case, and I don't need to do it the whole way. You just see so it stays in place. And what I'm going to do after I'm done sewing is I'm going to go and I'm going to trim around the outer edge so I have this down to size. So we're going to start with this piece here. This is section B. And to sew, you want to put your sewing machine at a 1.2 to 1.7 stitch length. That means how far apart your stitches are. Typically we sew at a 2 to 2.2 stitch length, and for this we want a shorter stitch length so that it perforates our seam line and it makes the fabric easier to pull away. So for this one, remember, we're placing our fabric right side facing out with the wrong side of the pattern facing the wrong side of the fabric. The right side of the pattern, the lines are facing up. You can kind of see here. This is where we get into it. So we have this fabric and we need it to end up here, but we have to sew it with a invisible, like the seam on the inside, just like normal. So I'm going to turn this over. What I like to do is try to keep this in place as much as possible, and I like to kind of press a little bit there, and then I have kind of that guide of where my seam is going to go, and I'm going to place my fabric. So if this was a fabric that's printed, I would put my, if this was my side that has the pattern, I'm going to face that towards my pattern on the bottom piece. So right sides together. I'm going to line this edge and I'm going to hold those in place. If you feel more comfortable, you can pin them, but you remember you have to sew on that line on the other side. So you could pin it down here so your needle isn't going to be in the way of your foot. So we're going to turn that over. See, I have it in place. I usually use my fingers. I want to make sure that this and this are about a 1/4 inch over. And then I'm going to just stitch right along this dark line. And for me, I go all the way through the seam allowance. So I kind of line it up back here, sew down all the way with my shortened stitch length, and I do not do a back stitch. lift up that. You can see here, I stitched from over the edge to over the edge along that black line. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take out my needle, pin, I guess. I'm going to make sure when I open this up, see how you have a nice finished seam now? And I want to make sure that this fabric, once opened up, covers the rest of that piece where it's going to be. And it does. Once it's trimmed down, it'll be perfect. So to take care of this little piece, this isn't too bad, but I like to trim that off so it's roughly 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and it's straight. So how I do that is I just pull back this and then I just cut with scissors about 1/4 inch away. So it's a nice even seam allowance. And you can actually, they have rulers that you can do the same thing. It adds 1/4, so you can line up the 1/4 inch and rotary cut along that, and that gives you perfect. If you don't have an iron close, this is what this thing is for. My brain is like forgetting what it's called right now. So you're just gonna press down on that to flatten it, and it holds it in place. And because we were done with this piece, not super necessary, but if you're doing multiple pieces at a time, it's nice so you don't have to stop and go to your iron all the time. So then once we get all of the rest of our pieces sewn, I am going to show you how we're going to trim this out so it's a perfect black. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next section. Remember which piece you cut for which. So I'm going to start with this piece. Again, right side's facing down, right side of pattern facing up. We're going to line this. So last time I showed you, because you want it to be here, how you did it. So this time I kind of align it how I'm going to sew it. So I know that I want to sew it over here and sew along that seam, and then I'm going to fold it back over. See, like that, but on the other side. So that can be confusing. So I'm going to kind of keep my paper and my bottom fabric where it is. I'm going to lay that down, and I'm going to kind of fold this over on that crease. And I'm going to align it with about 1/4 of an inch sticking up. I'm going to fold that back up. So now I have it in place so that when after I sew it, it will fold up into the place of this. So again, this one is a little bit different. The last one we sewed, this seam that I'm sewing now went through both sides like this seam does. But this one ends, so I'm actually going to start my needle in that point right there. And you could do a lock stitch if you want, or if your stitch length is small enough, you shouldn't have an issue. Sometimes I will do 1 stitch past it. And I'm going to sew all the way to here and keep going through the seam allowance, keeping that line in. So when I bring my needle down, which you can't see, I'm going to keep that right at the beginning, basically. This ended up being a little bit before. I'm going to sew along that line, go through the seam allowance, and then I have my seam, you can see there. It goes a little bit past, which is fine. It goes all the way through. My fabric, when folded up, has a nice finished seam. It covers the whole triangle area, but I need to trim away this seam allowance. So what I do there, sorry, I'm moving it all around. I'm going to fold this down at that seam that I just sewed, crease it, and I'm going to cut that seam allowance about 1/4 inch away. Again, you can do this with a rotary cutter and a ruler if you want on a cutting mat. I'm going to fold that back up, and then I'm going to turn it over to this side so I can fold my fabric up, press it, You can do this with an iron or this seam presser. That's what it's called, right? Seam roller. Then I have to put this piece on, which when you turn it over is this section, and you can see it has a straight line, which is really nice. If I fold it there, that can kind of give me a little registration mark. This is my piece of fabric for there, and I know I'm going to have it up here, but I've got to fold it down right sides together. This is my crease. This crease is my seam line, so I know I want the edge about 1/4 inch above that seam line. Hold it in place. Again, you can pin it. I'm going to turn this over, and again, you can flip that back and see, yes, it looks like I have enough fabric. I'm going to stitch all the way through, including the seam allowances. No back stitch with a short stitch length, 1.2 to 1.7. On my next piece, I'll actually show myself sewing it, or at least the machine sewing it. You might not see me. So there is my seam. Looks like we have a little piece of extra thread there. Again, we've got extra fabric we want to cut off, so I'm going to fold this down. I'm going to trim that up 1/4 inch, roughly. You just want it to be even and nice looking, because sometimes you do see those seam allowances through the fabric, as you may have noticed in my star in the beginning. And then flip it back to the side, fold that fabric up, press that seam, and now I am ready to trim that black. So let's switch our vantage point to see if we can see the sewing machine sewing our next section, which is very similar to our last section. It's kind of like the mirror image side. And we will go from there. Let's see how that works. Okay. So you can see here that my stitch length is just barely past the 1. It's kind of the vantage. It's probably about 1.2. Again, a little bit different vantage points. Let's see if I can show you without showing you a bunch of my hand. This is what we're stitching first, D1. I was not very clear on my other pieces, but always start with number 1, then number 2, then number 3. Since it's my own pattern, I know it very well, and I forgot to mention that when I was actually sewing. Pattern, darker lines facing you, fabric right side facing away, so the wrong side of the fabric and the wrong side of the pattern are together. We are going to line this fabric piece up. Again, we want this behind. We want it about 1/4 inch above. This is how I'm going to line it up back there. I'm following because we have a rectangle with plenty of room on either side to cover that triangle that you can see through there a little bit. I'm allowing a little bit of room on either side, so when I line it up, it's perfect. So this is another way you can line it up as you get a little bolder. You can kind of fold that down, fold it back up, check multiple times. And I'm going to sew starting up here. I'm going to continue that line through, and I'm going to end at that line. So let's see if we can get you a little bit closer. Okay, what do we think about that? Let's see. Again, I haven't moved my fabrics. I'm going to reach this hand around and put down my presser foot, just making sure it is lined up pretty accurate. You can pin those fabrics together into the pattern if you would like. And sometimes it doesn't start because you can't quite see unless you're really close over. So I'm going to do a quick back stitch there just because I wasn't quite to the back of the line. Not a big deal if it's a stitch or two. I'm going to sew then directly along that line, and I'm going to end it basically half a stitch past the line there, you can see. So there's my sewn line. So I'm going to turn that back over. Remember, I'm going to fold this down so I can cut the seam allowance. And I fold it down so I don't cut my pattern piece, in case that was not clear. 1/4 of an inch trimmed off. And lift that back up, turn it around, lift my fabric into place. Usually I do like to do that before I cut my seam allowance, just to make sure it covers all of the fabric, or the piece there. See, it's plenty of fabric over there. So then I'm gonna do that again with my last fabric that's gonna go here. So because this is a straight line along that seam, it's easy for me to kind of put it in place, and then I know I have to put right sides together. And I'm reiterating this a lot because this is the tricky part of foundation paper piecing, is knowing how to align those pieces so they're sewn correctly and then they open back up correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just fold it down so my right sides are together, and it's the opposite of how it goes up here. And I can kind of fold this down, finding that seam line. Oh, see, there's plenty of fabric there. So I'm actually gonna scooch it down a little bit, and I have a little bit of a seam line here, crease line. So it's roughly 1/4 inch above. Try that again. There. So I'm going to keep these together, and I just usually use my fingers. Again, you can pin it, but pin it down here so you're not hindering your seam with your feed dogs. But I keep it together by just keeping my fingers in place, holding it very steady. I'm going to put that right there and start it back fine and sew. Okay, I actually moved my camera one more time. You guys know I love you because this camera is literally in front of my face. So I have to kind of look oddly around it to get the right vantage point. I am starting with my needle back here, past my seam allowance. So straight through there. My lighting is changing because it's getting darker as I make this video. Winter is the worst, guys. I love winter because I love snow, but the lighting is tricky. Oh, look, I've got a little straggler. Okay. Looks like we did okay. Let's check this piece. Open it up. Press a little bit with your fingers just to make sure it's fully covered. And now we can do our trimming process. So remember how I fold this down. Take my scissors. Trim, that's a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch. The reason you trim, aside from seeing the seam shadow, is there's so much bulk. You get a lot of fabrics up in here and you really need to trim them away. Otherwise, you're gonna have a very bulky foundation paper piece, and that's not fun. And then I'm gonna use my seam roller here, that's what it's called, and press that down a little bit more. You know, clean up the threads because they like to hold on. And there's our piece. So now we're gonna go trim all of our pieces. Okay, I'm just here at my ironing board. We did seam press. Oh, look, shadows. I'm gonna open my curtains. Will that help? Oh, look at that, helped a little bit. We did seam roll with that hard seam roller, but I do often like to do a press just to get out any of these extra wrinkles here that, you know, because I don't press my fabric all the time. I do press on the fabric side because I want to make sure I get those seams smoothed out as much as possible. And careful with steam. This does tend to make your paper roll up a little bit, which is not a big deal. You just have to pay attention with when you're trimming then. Just gonna press out so it's nice and smooth. That's lovely. All right, so I'm gonna finish pressing here and then I will meet you at the cutting table. You know what is the hardest part of making these videos is aligning the cameras where they're supposed to go. Okay, so we are here at the cutting board. We have our paper pieces pieced for our 6-inch big star from the To the Stars pattern. It's upside down, but you get the picture. Okay, we're gonna turn that right side out. Okay, they're all sewn together. We are making this star. See how you can see that seam allowance coming through? Purely because of the light. This is a light fabric. On dark fabrics, you don't. And even laying against something, let's see. You see less of it. But that's why we want a nice, even seam allowance cut. Those are all hand cut. Those are not cut by a rotary cutter. You can do it. So that's what we're making. Also, you see how much bulk is in some of these areas. So there's a certain way that you can press the seams as well, and that helps. Trying to press the seams where there are less seams is ideal. All right, moving on. This is very handy at this point to have a rotary cutter and a ruler. Not super necessary. You could, if you have a very steady hand, use your scissors and cut. This is fabric scissors and I'm cutting paper. Oh my goodness. But you could cut right along that line. Ooh, cutting through the seam is a little tricky, so I get a little bit farther up there. But that was stressful. So I highly recommend a rotary cutter. If you are used to using a rotary cutter, it's the best. Where did my garbage go? Oh, it's all the way behind me. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now, I am a stickler, and even though it's my own pattern, I check everything. We're gonna have a little bit of a reflection here. I like to measure. So I place my 1/4 inch mark from the edge of my ruler on that dark line, and I cut along there. It is up to you. You can cut in the direct center of that light line. You can cut exactly 1/4 inch. This pattern, these patterns that I make with FPP, I use EQ8 to generate my templates, and they always do this with this little tick mark. Don't really need to cut that. I do and I don't. Usually if I'm going to cut it, I cut one side. So I'm going to take my piece, I'm going to lay it down. Had to move something off screen so that it's out of the way. If you're not going to cut those tick marks, you could just line it up anywhere. Sorry for that little reflection. I'm going to move it down a touch. I am putting my 1/4 inch line over the 1/4 inch seam mark, and I am cutting right along there, scooping that away. Rotate and repeat. If you want to cut those tick marks, you can actually cut them partially while you're cutting. By this little dot here on mine is where the 1/4 inch meets from this side and this side. So I align that with the edge, line my line, and then you can cut along that there. Cut here and then do that other tip. Little tick mark at the end. Just like this. Cut. Oops, I shifted. So that is the trick, because you're putting your ruler on top of paper. It is slippery, so you have to be really careful. So you're just going to continue around your pieces until you are done. So I do have to say, when you get some pattern pieces that have large sections where there's no seam, you do have to be extra careful that your everything stays aligned, which is why I always press with the iron before I trim as well, because I feel like that smooths it out. You could also put a little extra stitch with your machine along somewhere around the edge, not on the seam line, but out here. Because the more seams you have, the more paper you have to peel away. If it's on the edge and then you cut through it when you're trimming, it goes right away. So we just finished this piece. So this is how it looks when you see the paper pattern. But when you're done, you are going to have it look like this, which is just the reverse. It's pretty great. So I'm going to set that up there. If you're really great and you have a ruler that fits it, you can do 2 sides at once, one side. Be careful not to shift it because it's paper and it's slippery. Two sides. And just continue until you have all your pieces trimmed down. Just trying to remember if there's anything else that I should tell you about this section. My rotary blade is getting dull, so sometimes it leaves a thread before I cut to the end when they're all trimmed out. So there it is. Again, we want to flip it over, place it right there. That's where it goes. Boop. It's off screen though. Okay, so I'm going to finish trimming these up and then we will sew them together to a star. Okay, remember how I said you can cut that last little tick off? You see that little extra? Okay, so here are our pattern pieces. So it does show in the pattern, often foundation paper piecing patterns, it's a mouthful, will have a layout so that you can see how it goes together. So in my pattern, it says sew section A to section B. So you can see in this, it makes most sense that those would be sewn together. So I am going to put them right sides together, align that edge. This is what I do visually because these pattern pieces, once I get really good someday at Illustrator, I'm going to make my FPP patterns like this, but I'm not really good at Illustrator at all. So I don't know how to do it yet. I imagine a line from here to here. You could draw a line like that. This little tick mark on the pattern is supposed to be aligned with your edge. You can kind of see there. But that line, it's an invisible line. This line, if it continued all the way straight out, it would end where this fabric ends. Like they converge at that point. So I am going to sew, that's how I'm going to align them. And I'm going to sew all the way across. Again, I am not going to backstitch because I have a short stitch length. You still want to keep that for sewing the sections together. And this is a trick to reduce bulk of paper and for paper that you have to peel away at the end, because after your pattern is all sewn together, you still have these papers on. I end up taking one paper off before each seam. And so that means I'm going to take this one because it has no seams on it. And I'm going to sew on this side so I can see my line to sew. So all that means is instead of sewing this line first and then having to tear this paper away, I have it in place. I'm going to gently remove it. Now, keep it in place. You can pin it if you feel comfortable. And I'm just going to sew on this side, and then I don't have to tear that paper away after. And it just reduces the bulk. So I'm going to go sew from this edge to that edge, no back stitch, and I'll be right back. Okay, I did my sewing. This is the side without paper. It looks a little funny, but I'm showing you this because it doesn't go, the fabric doesn't go all the way to the end. You can eliminate that problem by not cutting those notches off. Again, my fabric, where my seam meets is where the back meets the front. I'm gonna, you can see on this side, straight through the seam allowance, straight through the seam allowance. I'm gonna open this up. Where did my seam roller go? I'm gonna do a little bit of a seam roll because I typically do this at my machine and I don't interrupt. You can, by getting up to the iron. So you can see this one's a little bit off because, you know, it wasn't perfect. Nobody's perfect. But typically this line would continue straight up here. It's fine like this. If that's in the seam allowance, it doesn't bother me. If it bothers you, you can unpick. But trust me, unpicking these is brutal because they're so close. If you feel uncomfortable, you could baste it first and then sew after. And some people actually glue those, I believe, but I think you'll be fine. Just takes a little bit of practice. Okay, so my pattern, I say sew section A and B, which is now sewn together, to section C. So, I know my voice is weird right now. Section C. As they're laid together, I know I want to put right sides together and I want to line up that seam. So I'm just going to pick this up. And it's right about there. Remember how I said to envision this goes all the way out? You want where that hits the edge to hit the edge of the piece behind it. And this one's a little bit easier because, look at this. This lines up pretty close to perfect up there. See that little point, how it's almost hitting the edge of the fabric there? Again, I would peel this fabric off, this paper off first and sew on this side, but I'm not going to do that this time because I like you all and I'm going to show you how it works without doing that. The trick with pulling the fabric off is it gets wobbly, so you have to be extra careful at holding it together. But I'm going to go sew along that seam allowance and I'll be back. Here we go. So we are all sewn again through the seam allowances. It's getting dark. Let's hurry this up. I do recommend cutting your little threads. We are going to fold this over. On this pattern, I like to actually fold my seams towards the outer edge on these two bigger seams. I don't know why. It feels better to me. You don't have to do that. You can do it however you like. This is the point where I'm going to take off some paper. I mean, you guess you don't have to, but you could. Let's not, because we want to sew it here. So you're going to sew this last piece D on, keeping your seam allowance. This is why I take off paper typically before I sew, is because if I fold this back and I sew, you'll get little divots of paper in there. So yeah, this is how you peel away paper. Let's just jump right into this right now. You want to fold at the stitch line once at least. And then I like to hold my finger on the end here of the stitch because even though they're short stitches, sometimes they can pull. And holding it at the beginning ensures that it won't pull. Just tear along until you get to the next seam. Tear it away. Then kind of pull that away. Fold it down at the next seam. Tear it away. It's very satisfying. But if you're doing like 20 blocks like this, not the most fun. Again, if you can't fold it, no big deal. Try and fold it, but you can just tear it. And it's perforated enough, but I prefer tearing. It seems to take a little bit less time. When it's in between seams like this, you just kind of have to use your nail to pop it up. It usually works pretty easily because it tears right around that perforated edge. And it's great. We're going to use that seam roller. You could also press with an iron. You do have to be careful once you take the papers out because a lot of your foundation paper piecing is bias edges. So you have to be extra careful that the alignment works. Look, that does not line up at all, but that's because our seam allowances are in there. We're going to sew along here. So we put right sides together. We're going to do that lining up thing again. The point goes right here, goes to the end. We're going to envision that line comes down and intersects, and we're going to go sew all along that line our final seam. It's exciting. Okay, there we are, our final seam. I am going to just fold this back. Look at that beautiful star that we just made. There you go. So I typically leave my papers in at the end. So when I finish this block, I would have this paper left to peel because I peel off the papers as I go. And I'm going to leave that paper in until the end. If I don't peel the papers off, I only do that really with this pattern because it's my own pattern and it works best for me. I'm going to leave all my papers in until I'm ready to sew the black, or I'm going to take all my papers out and I'm just going to do a stitch about 1/8 of an inch all the way around. And that's a stay stitch since you have a lot of bias edges. Right now we're going to finish peeling these papers out. It's kind of fun. Okay, so again, oh, see, that one came really well. But if you can bend it a little bit, that's great. You can kind of see I just squished the fabric together. Squish. Comes out. These little guys usually come out really well. If I'm getting to the corner or the edge where my where my thread starts, your fabric starts there too. I do like to hold it sometimes just so that we don't pull stitches out. Because sometimes those papers do not like to come out as easily. This is going super great. So we're just going to pull all those guys out, making a mess. When I am done paper piecing, my sewing room is like a shredder invaded because there are paper scraps everywhere. I just throw willy-nilly. See, I'm not even, that one was kind of perfect. You sometimes get that happen if you don't like do it good enough. So just let that be your lesson. There we go. It is a star. It is beautiful. You did it. Good job. So you can see in here, because it's a lighter fabric, you can see some of those seam allowances. You can see on the back, it looks like we cut those pieces out with a pattern piece and we sewed them together, traditionally pieced. Okay, that's everything. I just want to reiterate, a seam roller is excellent, not necessary, but great. You can even get them at art supply stores. They have these that are used for ink and you can get it there. This is, it's round and in the middle, it's a little bit curved. So they also have ones that are flat. Those are great. But if you can't find that, just keep your seam in the middle more. Rotary cutter is nice. Scissors are a must. If you have a rotary cutter, you definitely need a ruler, sewing machine, thread. That's all great. The pattern is great. This is a good semi-beginner. Some of my testers, who are all amazing and helped me out so much, had not done much FPP, and they're great. And this, they did it. You can do this. I believe in you. If you are more advanced or you would like to try harder things, I have many more patterns that are FPP. My moths, my bulldog, the sparked quilt has FPP points. That might be it. I don't remember. I'm gonna make more. I have more in the vault ready to come out. The awesome thing about this pattern, whether it's the big star or the little star, is you can turn it in any orientation and it looks good, in my opinion. So it's a great pattern to have. Shameless plug right there. If you need to trim this down, it's easy to trim down because you've got lots of space around it. And I would double check that you are at 6.5 inches after you trim it, because that's what it is before it's finished. So you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, especially if you're putting it with other 6-inch squares. You want it to be the same size. Thanks so much. We'll see you at the next pattern.